Welcome to Seafood Matters. Welcome to our listeners. On this episode, I'm welcoming Dave Mackay. Now, Dave has worked all his life. He's been born and brought up in the fishing industry and worked all his life in it. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Thanks for having me. I feel a bit of a fraud sitting here because all the other people that seen interviewed are still active in the fishing industry. I'm now very much a spectator, a very interesting spectator, but a spectator all the same. I started going out commercial fishing with my grandfather when I was 5. I started going out with my father on the same boat called the Corona when I was 11, and I have never stopped.
You didn't spend your whole life as an actual fisherman.
I didn't spend my whole life as a fisherman. By the time I was 16, I was considered to be a good enough deckhand to be qualified for a full share. But my choice in life was rather different. I stayed on at school, went to university, got a degree in zoology with a specialisation in marine biology, and became a marine scientist working in the marine laboratory. First of all in the pelagic section, and then in the shellfish section. And I worked in the marine laboratory for 27 years until the marine laboratory had to lose a number of posts, and I volunteered because I could no longer put up with the way that government was treating the scientific advice that they got to manage the fishing industry.
Is that correct?
No.
You call yourself a spectator. I think that's a wee bit unkind because you're pretty close as a spectator, and you're still very much involved. You still go out with boats and that, maybe not with the precise purpose of as a scientist, but you're still acting close to the fishing. Do you feel, has that improved any over time, that the way the government...
No, I think it's got worse.
Yeah.
I think it's got worse. The fishermen blame the scientists because they think that the scientists have the power to set quotas and the regulations. But the scientists do not pass the laws. They do not present the orders that are turned into law. Those are done by the politician. And the politicians have failed the fishing industry for as long as I remember. I remember them going to war twice with Iceland to protect the fishing industry, and they lost both of those wars. They have never, I think, fully appreciated the damage that bad regulation does to the fishing industry. They have historically always chosen the path of least resistance because that appears to be the easiest way. And we have a situation now where the fishing industry struggles to recruit new people. If you see a young person on the boat, it will almost invariably be the skipper or the mate's son, somebody that has a financial interest in the boat. Very few people now leave school and go into the fishing industry because there is no prospect in the industry, or virtually no prospect in the fishing industry for somebody that's not a link to somebody that owns a boat. When I was a boy, all my classmates at school in Sandend, a little fishing village, their ambition was to leave school, get a job on a boat, save enough money to get a share on a boat, and eventually become a skipper. I don't think I'm alone, but when I started earning money going to sea, first thing that happened when I got home was that my mother took half of it from me and put it in the bank. I didn't know she put it in the bank, but when I left school to go to university, she gave me a bank account with all this money. And I suspect that the mothers of almost every other boy in the village, when they got to an age when they were looking to have cash in their hand to invest, their mothers produced bank books that said, "Here you are, that'll buy you your first share."
Brilliant.
But that idea that you can go into the industry and reach the top, the CEO of your own business. Because if you look at these big boats now, their earnings are equivalent to a medium-sized company. But yet, I think fishermen themselves don't realise just how economically valuable they are to the country. But the government just ignores it.
I think it's a great way of putting it, and I think you're 100% right. Sadly, I can even go back as far as my father, when we were kids, and he used to say to me, our biggest problem with the fishing, it's a big percentage for the coastal communities and the fishing villages and towns, but the fishing industry to the government is such a low percentage of the GDP that it's not enough interest.
If you look at, we have left the EU. I make no bones about it, and I told that I argued vehemently for us to stay. But there are two policies, food policies in the EU. There's a farming policy and a fishing policy. The farming policy is all there to guarantee farmers safe and continuing income. And the fishing policy is there to make it as hard as possible for fishermen to have a safe and guaranteed income. All the regulations are bans.
Yeah.
There are no sensible regulations on minimum prices, but the EU didn't pass any sensible. There were no buy-up schemes to buy unwanted fish.
Yeah.
They were just sent for fish meal. So it's not only the British government that failed fishermen, the EU failed fishermen as well.
Yeah, still doing it.
They're still doing it. The EU, along with the British government, claimed to have environmental issues at the centre of their whole policies. But the EU still support and argue for the right of Danish fishermen to slaughter the food stock of large parts of the North Sea and take them ashore and turn them into fish meal to feed pigs.
That's the industrial fishing.
Industrial fishing.
What's your views on industrial?
The industrial fishing is just an anathema. There is no logical reason in the management of the fisheries in the North Sea to allow industrial fishing.
That's interesting. Yeah, coming from somebody with a scientific background, that's really powerful to hear.
There are virtually no checks and balances in the Danish fishing industry. They are theoretically not supposed to land to catch more than 10% of edible species and put them to fish meal. But once modern industrial boats have fish meal plants on board, there are no observers there to ensure that the 10% rule is matched. If you look at the grounds that they fish in, the grounds they fish in are surrounded by boats fishing for haddock, whiting, cod. You're not telling me that the herring, you're not telling me that those Danish boats fishing for fish meal can somehow manage not to catch the cod, the haddock, the whiting and that are there. And they just go straight into the fish meal plant.
And then there's no way of tracing what species they were, I suppose.
No.
Yeah.
But you could do it in the old days where they landed the fish meal plants ashore. Even though it was soup, you could take a sample of the soup and you could identify pick out the otoliths that were in its soup and look at the different otoliths because you can identify which fish it is from the shape of the otoliths.
Would I not be right in thinking, now you're talking about the days when the politicians were interested enough in the fishing to do it, but I don't think there's that interest now.
Well, the politicians are only interested in politics. They're not interested in making sure that life gets better for people.
Do you think they're interested in politics or politicians
Well,
themselves?
I think it's the thing that really puts them their nose out of joint is the amount of expenses that they can claim.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's getting off the thing. We have had poor governance of the fishing industry for a long time. It took until about 10 years ago for proper compensation payment to be made for fishermen that fish distant waters out of Aberdeen, Hull, Grimsby, Fleetwood, when their distant water fishing opportunities disappeared. And with those, the jobs that those men had just lost. When the buyout scheme was introduced, payments were made to the boat owners, but there was no consideration given to what would happen to the fishermen themselves.
But Dave, going back to that aftermath of the Cod Wars and that, I found it really interesting talking to people in the industry down in Hull and Grimsby and places like that who were directly, obviously, involved. And I was young at the time, maybe never thought with enough depth in it. But yes, I, like everybody else, as you mentioned earlier, we lost. And I've read a book since by the British commercial attaché, and the book's called Cod Wars and How to Lose Them.
Yeah.
But when speaking to people down in the Humber, I discovered that it was bad negotiations. It wasn't that their ships beat our ships. It's when it came down to the negotiations. And Iceland offered us a tonnage. And our industry said to the government, look, our fleet are aging. We've not got the catching capacity we had in the past. What they're offering is a target more than a limit.
Yep.
He says, we'll struggle to catch what they're, I think it's about 70,000 tonne, we'll struggle to catch what they're offering us, so take it.
Yep.
Our government, no way a small island in North Atlantic is going to dictate to Britain. So because we're British and they're just a small dot in the North Atlantic, they wouldn't accept it.
But the negotiations with the EU were much the same. They were all about Britain apparently protecting itself. In real terms, Britain, having left the EU, instead of trying to deal with fisheries within the framework of the EU, should have gone all out for a renegotiation of the whole laws that govern how fish stocks in the North Sea were to be shared out. We're still bound by the London Convention, which was passed by a whole series of nation states, all the nation states that fished in the North Sea in 1960. 1960 is 64 years ago.
Yeah.
And we've still got quotas, shares, that are dependent on the catches 60 years ago. Now, any industry that hasn't reviewed its basic legal framework for 60 years is not very efficient. The government has had numerous mistakes in how to manage the industry. I think the latest one was the buyout scheme, when boats that they bought out had to return their licenses to the government, but not their quota. They allowed people and organisations that had no current locus in the industry to own the most valuable thing in the industry, which is their quota. We have ended up in a situation where quota is rented without any legal framework for how that's done. It's done on a gentleman's agreement. But there's no law that says that you could rent your quota. There's no law that says that, you could sell your quota. There's a law. There should have been a law that said you can't sell your quota.
And what do you feel about that situation to rectify? Because, as you say, young people, it's impossible for them to get into the industry now. And maybe, as you said there earlier, a young person, all your age group and your friends and classes, school and Sandend. I'm from Helmsdale. It was exactly the same. Have our own boat, because it was all family boats anyway, and the younger people were coming in as the grandfathers were retiring or passing away. How do you see that? One of the things that in our previous podcast, a guy, Mike Kaiser, with Heriot-Watt University, says that what we need to do as far as not just quota, but quota management, stock assessment, right across the board, industry takes control.
Well, to put it crudely, we privatised the fishing industry by allowing the two things that are essential to catch fish, which is a fishing licence and quota, to be privately owned, and we allowed those to be traded. Government now apparently manages the industry, but it doesn't have the levers necessary to decide how the industry is going to work in the long term. Not that government's particularly good at that, but even if you set up a management board to manage fisheries, like fisheries are controlled by the fisheries boards and by the herring industry board, they made all the decisions on selling and net sizes and all those things, minimum landing sizes, were all made by fishery boards. If you return to that situation, until you have the levers that affect how licences are allocated, to whom the licences are allocated, and how the quota is shared out, that board is toothless.
A lot of them now, and as I was going to say, with monkfish, for example, they're not landed on the market. They're sold private because the person that's bought them owns a quota. So it's like, we'll give you a quota.
Well, in fact, they're actually contracting the boat to catch their quota and paying them. And
it's so wrong, because a fisherman is going out to sea with a gun at his head because he can't do what he wants to do.
Yeah, but because the whole management system that's used to calculate the quota depends on the assumption that what the fishing industry land is a representative sample of what they caught. Mm-hmm. If they choose not to land the smallest grades of cod or the smallest grades of haddock or the smallest grades of whiting, the whole system by which they analyse the health of the fish stocks is skewed. I listened to one of your other podcasts where you interviewed the guy the head of the ISIS system, and
Mark Dickey-Colas.
Yeah. Okay, the scientists have made guesses as to what is being thrown away, but that's only guesses. And the whole future of the industry is in the hands of guesses.
That's true, but the other thing which I feel, Dave, which directly is things that we've chatted about, yourself and I, there's another ICES related scientist I've interviewed after Mark, and that was Natalie Steins. I know she's Dutch-based. She actually says in our podcast, the information they get from fishermen is better than their own scientists. The figures they get is better. You'll know what she means by better as per but they reckon, and she says about how she feels, obviously it's Dutch boats, she's Dutch based in the Wageningen Research Centre, and she says how good a working relationship they have with fishermen. Now, I've said that to fishermen in Scotland, and they just say, well, we don't see that.
I think the problem is that the mutual animosity between fishermen and the managers. After all, the scientists in the UK are not the fishery managers. The fishery managers in the UK are fishery officers. It's the fishery officers that gather the data. It's the fishery officers that would instigate a prosecution. The scientists are only advisors.
Yeah.
But the fishery managers are a different group of civil servants. Most of them, if you put them on a boat, they wouldn't be able to tell you what was the bow and what was the stern.
Yep.
It's a long time since I was in civil service, because the Marine Laboratory was part of the civil service. But if you were in the administrative civil service and you were assigned to the fisheries department, you wanted your object in life was to get out of there as fast as possible.
Out of the Marine Lab.
But no, not the Marine Lab, in the fisheries department in the St Andrews House.
Okay.
You wanted to get out there as fast as possible, because you wanted to get into a department that had more clout. If your idea was to get on in the service and become a permanent secretary or somebody that was an advisor to a minister, you didn't want to be stuck in the fisheries department.
Yeah.
So the throughput of staff was enormous.
When you say that, I often feel from, as I said, I'm distant from it. I'm not directly involved, but speaking firsthand to many, many fishermen. I'm not saying they're always right, but they just don't seem to be any joint up thinking and talking between the Marine Lab and our fishermen. Whereas in the Wageningen in Holland, there's close contact, working relationship.
When I was in the Marine Laboratory in the 60s, in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, at least up until the end of the 80s, there were meetings every year at about the time of the quota negotiations with the Marine Laboratory and the fishermen, where the Marine Laboratory scientists explained their methodology and how they thought the stock assessment of the various species would go that year. Those stopped. I don't know why they stopped. I don't know whether it was the fishermen that stopped them or the Marine Laboratory that stopped them, or whether it was the fisheries department in Edinburgh that said that we don't want them to go ahead anymore. But they stopped,
Which is dreadful. It's really...
Well, it engendered a feeling of distrust. The scientists, they're asked to assess the state of the fish stocks using the data that they are provided with from the fishing industry. And they only do research surveys to fill in the gaps. Most of the research surveys are targeted at making an assessment of how many young fish there are in the sea that are going to come into the fish stock in the next year or 2 years, so that they can make an assessment of recruitment. Because if you don't have an assessment of recruitment, you cannot really make a meaningful assessment of how much you can catch.
But what is classed as recruitment? I would have thought when you're talking about recruitment, you're talking about younger fish that are coming into the fishery and hopefully growing and spawning and contributing to the next future stocks. But I've had a situation recently where we had small haddocks caught locally. It was rod caught, and there were small haddocks, and they were really thin. To look at them, you would have said, that haddocks, it must have been February, March, or April. And this was in the middle of August. And I sent samples to a good friend of mine who have been in previous podcasts, Jon Christensen in Iceland. And he sent me, I can show you it on my computer, he sent me back. They are over 5-year-old, fully grown, and they were 34 centimetres. They were just small, barely the minimum size. And he reckons they're fully grown and over 5 years. And he classed it, he felt it as overpopulation.
Well, at the end of the 1950s and into the beginning of the 1960s, there was an event that the scientists eventually called the Gadoid explosion. And it was when the stock that they were monitoring with most confidence was the haddock stock. When they had been the scientists in the marine laboratory had a index of recruitment, which was the number of haddocks that they caught in a hour's trawl in the average number per stat square just after the First World War, when steam trawling became the norm. And from the index up until the year class of 1958, and if I can remember the figures correctly, well, the biggest average that they got was 200 one group haddocks. That's a group of haddocks that were 1 year old in February or March. The biggest average was 200. In 1958, the average was 5,800. In 1962, it was 10,000 something. And in 1964, it was 5 figures again, or big 4 figures. So the population of haddocks in the North Sea had grown by an estimated 500 times. I was at sea in 1959 when the first on the Corona, when we were taking 10 lifts of fish every haul at the back of the West Bank, just off Fraserburgh. 10 lifts every haul, and so that's a total of 10 tons of fish.
Uh-huh.
And we sifted out of that 10 tons of fish 10 hundredweights of whitings. The rest of the 9.5 ton went over the side as undersized haddocks. In 1960, they were just under the size, millimetres under the size. But it took those year classes an additional year to reach the minimum landing size. And the minimum landing size at that time was 27 centimetres as opposed to 30 as it is now.
Yeah.
So those fish, the fact that there was so much fish that they were desperately undersupplied with food because they simply couldn't grow fast enough. A cleverer man than me tried to look at the management of fish stocks in the North Sea as a whole. His first starting point was that there's the same amount of food goes into the North Sea every year, because that's the amount of phytoplankton that produced by the diatoms and all the other plants that float about in the North Sea is controlled by the amount of sunlight. Although we as humans think that the amount of sunlight that there is varies hugely from summer to summer, but actually when you measure it, it's almost identical. But it's where that sunlight eventually ends up, whether it ends up in a herring or a mackerel or a cod or a haddock or in a puffin or a kittiwake, that is what is how the whole environment changes. Now, at the time when the Gadoid explosion took place and all these young haddocks were being produced, the herring stock and the North Sea mackerel stock were in the process of collapsing. East Anglian herring fishery collapsed in the early 1960s, I think. It just disappeared. The herring disappeared. Those herring that spawned in the North Sea, in the mouth of the channel, didn't live in the mouth of the channel all the year. They lived through the spring and the summer. They lived up in the northern North Sea. They were part of the northern North Sea ecosystem.
Yeah.
But that whole tranche of mackerel just disappeared.
I remember during the North Sea ban, the feeling within the industry was there should never have been a blanket ban, and if they left maybe a certain size of boat, drift netting, it would have at least kept part of the market open. Because when it did start again, they had nowhere to put their head in the market. They lost the market.
But the market was never there. The market was lost for herring in the 1930s. in real terms. The mass market for herring was lost when the Russian market closed immediately after the First World War, and when the German market collapsed in the mid-30s, when the German economy was suffering from hyperinflation. Now, the boats could catch 100 cran shots every day and couldn't sell them because nobody wanted to buy them. The market was in Europe, in the market. Nobody made any attempt to find a market for herring after the Russian and the German markets left. The market of last resort for the herring fishery was the fish meal plant. The ban lasted a couple of years. People aren't going, if you've got a product that somebody hasn't been able to get for 2 years, I would have thought that once that product was available again, you wouldn't be able to sell. You wouldn't be able to supply enough.
But it just lost the market, and the little bit of market was left. The Canadians were supplying it.
But I think the problem in there is a problem with processors rather than the catching side. One of the things that happened in Europe, it doesn't happen here, is that there was a much bigger cooperative systems developed in France and in the other big parts of Northern Europe, where the whole fishing industry was more integrated, that processors had an interest in the fishing boats, but fishing boat owners had an interest in the processors, and they worked hand in hand. But you get the impression that the processors and the fishermen hardly spoke to one another. Everybody wanted their own way.
I think that's better now because there's different organisations where there's fishermen, there's scientists, and there's processors, and they meet regularly. And I can't think of anything, but that's a fantastic idea. There's even people from the supermarkets. See, going back to when we're talking about the small haddock density stock, what do you think of the same scientist I mentioned earlier, Michael Kaiser, who had in a previous podcast? He also mentions the fact that rather than have a minimum size for a minimum legal landed size, have a maximum, because he reckons when you get some of the real big cod and haddock and that, when they get the real biggest of them, he reckoned that their eggs are a better quality and they have a more successful larvae.
Well, one of the big problems with whitefish management in the North Sea is cod and saithe, because cod and saithe are both 70 centimetres long before they spawn for the first time, so that you can catch huge amounts of haddock and whiting. If they're undersized, they're immature. They reach sexual maturity when they're just about the minimum size. But you've got a species like cod that doesn't reach sexual maturity for 3 years after it's got to the minimum landing size. The problem, it's very, very easy to design a net that lets small fish out. It's practically impossible to design a catching system that lets the big fish out. Now, if somebody could do that, it would be easy to manage a mixed fishery.
I get your point.
The net's effectively just a dynamic riddle, and there's no way that you can let the big fish out.
There's this system, it's still under trial, smart troll they call it, and that's got cameras, and they can almost literally watch what's in the net and decide in the wheelhouse what they let go and what stays in the net.
Just before I retired from the Marine Laboratory, they were experimenting with a net that was partitioned vertically. It had 3 stories. And you got, in the bottom story, you got cod and monks and prawns and flatfish. In the next story, you got whitings. And in the top story, you got haddock going into the net.
Would hake be in the higher section as well?
The hake would have been in middle and top as well. So if you decided that you didn't want to catch haddock, you could leave your top section open. It meant you lost a proportion of the fish, but you didn't get hauls that you had huge numbers of fish that you had to dump.
Yeah.
But but I suspect that this smart trawl is something similar to that, where you would have multiple core ends and you simply left one open.
There's a video of it.
You know,
I'll show you the website.
but the idea of the marine laboratory came from the diver up and camera up, because one of the eternal questions was that came up when you were consulted was, why don't you catch? You had only catch haddocks in some grounds at night. If you put cameras on the top of the net when you were trawling in the daytime, you would see the haddocks swimming over the top of the headline. They were there, but they weren't there. You see, when your net were not high enough to catch them, you know. And but when it came down dark, they couldn't see the net early enough to get up over the top. You know?
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, you have a story, Decca GPS.
I was asked at my establishment interview for the civil service when I was appointed to the Marine Laboratory at a local interview board in Aberdeen. But the civil service is nothing if it's not a centralised organisation. So I couldn't become an established civil servant until I had been approved by the Civil Service Commission. So I had to travel all the way to London to get an interview in London rather than an interview in Aberdeen. And one of the questions I was asked at that interview was, what was the most important development in fishing that occurred until that time? So that interview would have been in 1969.
Was it your view of what you thought was
the most important thing that I believed came about was the ability for boats to repeatedly go back to the same locations time and time and time again. The biggest development was the Decca Navigator system, which allowed them to go anywhere in the North Sea and tell exactly where they were and be sure that they were going to get their fragile net home without becoming fast or getting torn. And the Decca Navigator opened the whole of the North Sea to demersal fishing, instead of demersal fishing being largely confined to areas where you could see the land and get land sites. When my father first bought the Corona, he didn't have a Decca, and you just steamed out a quarter of a distance to a piece of ground, and you shot your seine net, hauled up, and if you got a good catch, you dropped a buoy and an anchor, and you fished from that buoy until catches declined. You hauled up the anchor, and you moved somewhere else and tried again. And when you got a good catch, you put the buoy over and repeated the process. My father was not alone. Every boat, every skipper that I ever saw had a whole library of notebooks where they recorded every catch, every haul, the Decca Navigator positions for every haul they made, and what the catch was. And that was their information base. Information base still exists now, but it exists on a plotter and memory sticks where they can refer back. And I've been on boats when the fishing was poor that would refer back through the library of data and try to work out somewhere to go.
And I suppose technology is just taking it on that bit.
Technology is now so sophisticated. We have a foul haul because you've torn your net or something. The skipper's made a mistake. It's not an accident anymore because all the ground is known. He just forgot whether there was a big lump of wreckage and that. You can trawl almost everywhere with modern hopper nets. No refuge.
My friend again, Jon Christensen, reckons that the fish can go under the hopper and over the net.
Fishing is still very primitive. The most inefficient fishing towed gear is a scallop dredge. They're terribly inefficient. They'll only catch less than 20% of the scallops that are there. The idea of scallop dredgers fishing out a piece of ground is just stupid.
Yeah.
Because the gear is so inefficient.
Yeah.
Scallop divers can fish out a piece of ground very easily. It's the same in nephrops trawling. If you think about it superficially, you would think that creeling for nephrops was a much less aggressive way of fishing than trawling for nephrops. But there's a huge difference between a trawled nephrops catch and a potted nephrops catch. If you get a potted nephrops catch, the number of the male and female nephrops, approximately the same numbers in a creel catch, but in a trawled catch, the catch is dominated by males, because males spend more time out of their holes than female. So if you're trawling, the male has a much bigger chance of being caught than the female. Because if you imagine a bed of a nephrops bed, if you can think such thing, you plonk a dose of creels on it. The female only has to come out once and go in the creel. If the male goes in the creel, it doesn't matter if he goes in first or last, he can only go in once.
Yeah.
But if you're throwing a bag along the bottom to try and scoop up the males and the females, the males are out for most of the 24 hours foraging. They're much more likely to be caught than the females, which only pop out for a few minutes and forage and go back into the hole.
Yeah, it's a fascinating observation, that one.
But it's so counterintuitive. If you're looking at it from an environmental point of view, you would think trawling must be more damaging than creeling. But if you're looking at it from a stock assessment point of view, the efficiency of trawling is so bad. And because crustaceans, nephrops, like other crustaceans, have harems, there is a superabundance of males.
Yeah.
The biggest males mate with all the females, and you've got a lot of spare males around it, so it doesn't matter if you catch them.
Yeah. I think crab were similar to that.
Crab or something, yeah. The sexual habits of crustaceans are very peculiar.
Yeah.
The female crustaceans can store sperm in their reproductive system for 3 years. So they can have 3 lots of eggs. They can fertilize 3 lots of eggs from one mating. So that once females have reached sexual maturity, they only molt once every 3 years. Molting is a very dangerous time for you. So if you can avoid molting, it's better for your survival.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that this once in every 3 years molting. So that means that if you get a big female lobster and a big male lobster, the female lobster will be 2.5 times older than the male. It's not exactly 3 because they all molt as fast as possible until they get to be sexually mature.
Yeah.
And when you're sexually mature, the females stop growing.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
See, going back to when we're talking about the stock assessment and the observation we have is there's a whole fleet of foreign-owned boats. A lot of them are British flags that are foreign-owned and then foreign boats, which a lot of them felt Brexit was going to take care of, which it did anything but.
Well, but how is Brexit going to take care of the foreign boats? The Spanish and French companies that own those boats, own the licenses, which they quite often own the boats, were originally British boats. Some members of the industry chose to sell those boats, licenses and quotas.
Yeah, from a stock assessment point of view, that boats, and one of the things that frustrates local people, I mean local as in right upper coastal communities, Shetland, down here on the west coast, is they're never monitored.
Well, but that's...
so how you mentioned earlier about the credibility of the stock assessment. If they're never, and I'm standing myself personally on the pier watching them, and there's not one person from Marine Scotland.
That's an operational decision that's been made by Marine Scotland, that those boats that are owned by countries other than the United Kingdom will A, not be boarded at sea by boats that are run by Marine Scotland, and B, they won't be inspected by the fishery officers that are appointed by Marine Scotland. Now, I don't understand the logic I don't see why. Those boats are Scottish boats. They're British boats. They're not French boats. They're not Spanish boats. They're British boats. They fish on a British licence. They should be treated in exactly the same way as everybody. It's a case of racial discrimination by the Scottish government and, I guess, by MCA in England as well, that they will be treated with kid gloves.
They're not even labelling their boxes. And to transship with no labels is illegal.
Yeah, if they're not governed by the rules set by the Spanish government, they're set by the rules that are made by Holyrood and Westminster. And if I was being absolutely frank, I would have said that Marine Scotland and the MCA were criminally negligent on this thing. And whoever made the decision really is doing the Scottish fishing industry and the English fishing industry a huge disservice. They come up with this furious argument that they can't do anything with their boats because they don't speak Spanish or French. Well, there's an easy solution for that. You just recruit people to the service that are bilingual or multilingual. And you say, this job is open to somebody that is proficient in speaking French and Spanish.
The troubling part, there just doesn't seem to be anybody interested. I know people that have met Marine Scotland and said this very words to them, and they've not even responded.
Well, because frankly, civil servants, like everybody else, want a quiet life. And the only people that are going to complain, the ultimate bosses are the people that sit in Holyrood and sit in the Palace of Westminster. If those people, if those MPs are quite happy for large sections of the civil service in Scotland and in England and Wales to not apply the rules, irrespective of colour, class or creed, then that's their fault. It's not the Scottish fishermen's fault, because they're the ones that are being discriminated against. But then I've been on board commercial boats that have been boarded. I've been on board one that was boarded by a fishery officer that was working on a Royal Navy boat, but that was down in the English Channel. But I've never been boarded by any of the fleet of protection boats that operate out of Scotland. I've been boarded by Norwegians, and I've been boarded. I was boarded at Rockwell by a German fishery protection vessel.
I've talked recently to a fisherman in Scravstead who has been boarded 8 out of his last 10 times he's landed. He's been monitored or boarded.
Mm-hmm.
And he just feels it's almost like victimization.
Well, it probably is.
And he'll be landing. In fact, I was talking to him. He was landing just about 2 weeks ago. And there was 2 of that foreign known boats that I'm talking about were landing as we were standing talking.
Yeah.
There was nobody near them. And that's coming from a person that was
but it's
uncautioned.
It's incompetence on the part of Marine Scotland, purely and simply.
And where's the tie between? Is there a tie between Marine Scotland and the Marine Lab?
Well, they're all part of the same organisation now. The Marine Lab has officially been disbanded. It's called Marine Scotland Science, I think now. And the head of the Marine Lab is not a scientist anymore. He's just a career civil servant.
Really sad.
Yeah.
I take it that probably all part of the fact that you said earlier, you left it because you didn't like the way it was.
Well, I didn't like the way that the government didn't care whether the regulations that they passed allowed boats to go to sea and not make a profit. There's no point having systems in place that destroy the industry. And the systems that were being put in place were in many ways destroying the industry. The buyout scheme became necessary, not because the industry had got to a stage that a large number of boats were simply unviable. I suspect fish prices now are really, in real terms, much, much lower than they were in the 60s and in the 70s. Fishing in the UK is still seen as cheap food. And as long as it's seen as cheap food, it will suffer. It's not coincidence that all the best fish was export. You go to, you go down to look at the local creel boats in Rocky. All their catch, or virtually all their catch, went to Spain. And just recently, one of the middlemen's gone bust. And those small boats landing lobster and crab and velvet crab are short of a large amount of money. And it's happened, it's not the first time the boats in the Scottish industry have found themselves out of pocket because a major processor or a major buyer has failed to meet their commitments.
I think that's happened more in shellfish than...
Well, yeah. Well, I think there are not so many people buying shellfish, so the risk is bigger. Over the years, there are quite a large number of scallop processors have gone bust, and they just disappear. Well, curiously enough, they don't. They appear somewhere in a few years hence under a different name.
Terrible.
You know?
What's your view on the modern stock assessment, the size of stock?
Well, I don't know. I have a view that I'm fairly certain they're wrong, but how they're wrong, I know they could be better. And one of the reasons that I believe that they could be much better, they assess all the stocks separately. If you have a situation where you have a large number of species, a significant amount of their food is one other species. Changes in the species that you're managing affect each other.
Yeah.
So if you look at sand eel is the basic food supply for some of the year for cod, haddock, whiting, saithe, puffins, guillemot, razorbills, seals, kittiwakes, terns.
Yeah. Would it be herring?
Herring as well, because herring eat a lot of larval fish and mackerel eat a lot of larval fish. Any difference in the size of the stock of one of those individual components has a knock-on effect on all the other components, all the other species. That unfortunately, fish stock management in the North Sea, or the management of the North Sea environment as a whole, has revolved around cod for the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years. Because cod has been seen as the iconic stock. We've got to get the cod stock up. We've got to get the cod stock up. Yeah. But cod, amongst all the predators of the sand eel, is probably the most efficient. Yeah. So the more cod there are, the bigger the impact on everything. For the past 5 or 6 years, all we've heard about, you hear about it this time of year, is the failure of breeding success of puffins, kittiwake, terns, and they're much more, because they're air-breathing animals, they must be much less successful than predating the sand eels than a cod that lives in that environment. The cod can predate sand eels 24 hours of the day, or for as many hours of the day as the sand eel's not buried in the sand. In fact, it might even be able to predate the sand eels where they're buried in the sand. The puffin and the kittiwake and the tern can only predate them during daylight hours, when they can see what they're doing. And they must suffer. And every time there's a failure of breeding success of seabirds in the British Isles, RSPB throw their hands up in the air and say, it's the fishermen. It's not the fishermen. It's the cod.
But do you not feel, if you look at any form in nature, if you preserve a species, then there's a knock-on effect?
We have, but the whole of Europe has decided that the common seal and the grey seal are such iconic animals that they must live irrespective of what damage they do.
Yeah.
That almost they've become untouchable.
Yeah.
And there's no logic to it. When they started the national park systems in Africa to protect African wildlife, they protected everything. But in some of them, the elephant populations grew so big because they were protected that they were destroying the environment that the national park was set up to protect. Well, I think we've got to that stage with seals, that there are now so many seals all around the British Isles that they are in danger of destroying all the other animals that compete with them.
I was told once by an Eskimo. I was in Iceland, and these people were over from Greenland, and they were working. So were working in some of the fish plants in Iceland. They eat the seal, and they feel that it's a big part of their diet. But he reckoned to get bitten by a seal more poisonous than getting a bite from a rat.
Well, presumably seals don't clean their teeth. Yeah. So that if you're bitten by any wild animal, you're going to get. They're not poisonous as such, but you will get pieces of decomposing prey pushed into that part of your body where they're bitten you, so that you're likely to have problems associated with fishing. That dragonets are poisonous. Well, I don't think dragonets are poisonous per se, but if you get spiked by a dragonet, it's usually quite deep, and there's a lot of the slime that's on the dragonet gets injected into your arm.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're working on a fishing boat, you don't have time to take your glove off, go and get to the first aid kit and disinfect your finger, and then rub it up with a bandage so you can't get your glove back on again. So you eventually end up with an infected finger. There are some fish that are poisonous, that manage to store the neurotoxins that are produced by phytoplankton, and they can inject those neurotoxins into you. But they're very unusual.
Okay.
But most of the poison, I can remember going to, when I was going to sea with my father, I never had poisoned fingers when I was going to sea. But the first week after I went back to school, I had poisoned fingers. Yeah. Because when you're at sea, your hands are continually being disinfected by salt water. And particularly in those days when the quality of rubber gloves wasn't as good as it is now, and fresh water was scarce. So you washed your hands in a bucket of salt water. So you actually disinfected your hands every time you washed them.
Yeah. Even my wife, Mary's, was a nurse, and a number of times I'll maybe suggest her of a problem with my gum or tooth or something like that. And every time she'll say to me, have a mouthwash of salt water.
Yeah. Until we get the stock assessment, or should I say the marine management of the species, that both the species that we target with fisheries and the species that compete with us targeting with fisheries are all managed in the same way. The problems that we have with seals at the present time will continue.
Well, that's just a perfect example to the question I asked about when you control and protect certain species, because if it was left to nature, there would be a more balance.
Well, it's quite interesting, and I have a theory that if seals didn't have big brown eyes and had long snake-like tails, they would be treated the same as rats. They would be seen as a danger to human beings.
A lot of people up north here, mainly around the Shetlands, feel there's a huge insurgence of the orca, the killer whales.
Yeah.
And many a person feels that's nature's way of controlling. We're not attended to, so here's Mother Nature.
I'm waiting for the day that there have been examples of orca pods coming into the Moray Firth and blood in the water, where they play fast and loose with a whole load of seals and they ate them. When the seal conservation lobby and the orca conservation lobby get together to discuss which is right and which is wrong, do we kill the seals or do we kill the orcas? And I would say, well, you leave it to nature.
Yeah.
But it is, I think there is the law of unintended consequence comes in as soon as you as soon as you make anything sacrosanct, as they have done with seals. Because the legislators have backed themselves into a corner by passing a blanket ban and not passing legislation that allowed any management policies to come about. I'm convinced that the only time the legislators will consent to actually tackle this thorny problem is when seals start attacking people on the beach. Okay, they deal with it now by putting up signs to say, beware of the seals. Seals are wild animals. Their behaviour is unpredictable. But how long are we as humans going to say that that's the right way to deal with it? It's a wild animal. It shouldn't be controlling us. We should be controlling it.
But the people that are protecting it think that everything should be running wild apart from us.
Well,
I'm
I'm blooming sure that if they had a rat in their house or a wasp nest in their roof, they would have the animal elimination organisations in about to get rid of them.
That's right. And that's exactly, that hits it. A lot of fishermen call them the rat in the sea.
That's right. But for somebody, the sea is the fisherman's workplace. The seal, there was an assessment done recently by two of my former colleagues in the Marine Laboratory about the amount of fish that seals eat in the North Sea. And I forget the number exactly. But it was a very large tonnage.
I have heard in the past that the seal population around the UK's consumption of fish is greater than our total allowable catch.
That's right.
More than our fishermen are catching.
Yeah. That's tonnage. Now, if you consider that the seal has a particularly peculiar way of eating fish, and especially large fish, because it's entirely unsuited, its whole design that has evolved is entirely unsuited to eating a big cod. So it doesn't eat a big cod. It only eats a small bit of the big cod. And the small bit of the big cod that it eats is that bit that contains all its vital organs. Its stomach, its liver. They take out the bit that we throw away and they eat it. If you look at it, so that the amount of a cod that it actually eats is less than 25%, and the rest is simply discarded. Why? Seal researchers will swear blind that seals don't eat cod.
I think it's the same with salmon.
And they don't eat salmon. But the way that they assess the seal diet is wrong. They assess the seal diet by going around and collecting samples of seal poo. And then they wash it and sieve it, and they analyse it, and they go through the seal poo, and they count the number of the fish otoliths that is in the seal poo, because the seal doesn't digest the fish otoliths, it just passes through the digestive system. If you never eat the head of the cod, you will never have any cod otoliths. If you only eat the digestive system, it's a stomach full of sand eels, all you get is sand eel. I cannot logically believe that seals eat individual sand eels. The effort in eating individual sand eels is quite huge for an animal that size. They may eat the small, they say other things, mackerel and these sort of things, smaller species, but they're completely unsuited to eating a big fish. They have no way of swallowing, of chewing it, because all their teeth are not differentiated like ours are, and they have no way of holding the fish and chewing it.
Yeah. How do you see future of the fishing industry?
I think it's dire. The reason that I think it's dire is that it has an acute problem in recruiting people.
It's a good way to end.
Yeah.
So I would just like to thank you, Dave, for your time today, and it's been really interesting.
I hope you didn't get any poisonous letters and emails.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Maybe nobody will speak to me ever again.